So there's a lot of work around continuous improvement we can create where the first thing is really creating a feedback culture where you don't wait for the end of the year appraisal, that you really create a culture where informal, rapid feedback is valued, and the idea that feedback is a gift that can be created very powerfully. What I've seen some of the best organizations do, and I've helped them do it, is to sort of build in not just technical mastery improvement, but also non-technical human mastery. So how do you have conversations? How do you mentor someone? How do you communicate in difficult situations? How do you handle a challenging conversation? Building that in very explicitly, it's that kind of part of a mastery map of what an organization wants to do.
Hi, welcome to Evolve, a New Era of Leadership. I am your host, Carolyn Swora, and today's guest is coming to us from across the pond. That's right, we're going into the UK, and today we're going to be talking with Sharath Jeevan. He's a globally recognized authority on leadership, and he's written 2 books that I'm going to ask more questions about. They're called Inflection and Intrinsic. He has worked with a wide range of organizations to really help these leaders navigate their inflection moments and what he calls future-proof success. Sharath holds a degree from Cambridge University, Oxford University, and INSEAD. He's an alumnus of Strategy and eBay, and he founded and led 2 education organizations, which I'm also really curious to hear more about, because together they collectively impacted over 10 million children across 40,000 schools all over the world. Sharath's work has been featured in a wide range of global media as well, including The Economist, CNN, Forbes, Inc., CNBC, Financial Times, and The Telegraph, and now we can say on Evolve. He writes regularly on LinkedIn for a very wide audience, and as I said, is the author of 2 fabulous books, Intrinsic and Inflection. Looking forward to this conversation with him. Welcome, Evolve listeners. It's Carolyn Swora, your host, and today I'm really excited to be talking to our guest, Sharath Jeevan. Welcome.
Thanks, Carolyn. Such a pleasure to be on the show.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited. You've got just a wealth of experience in the space of leadership, and I'm really excited to hear more about your work and just the impact that you're having. Before we do that, I'd love to hear from you what influenced you to get into this field of leadership.
Yeah, so I'm the son of Indian immigrants to the UK, Carolyn, and in fact, I was born in India myself and came to the UK very young. I think seeing how much I spent a lot of summers in India growing up, and I think just seeing how much the country was moving and evolving and some of the challenges as well. I think seeing, for example, my grandparents who were very active citizens, very engaged in the world more broadly. I think that question of sort of, how do we try to shape the world we're in rather than just accept it as how it is? That came in at a very young age. And I think I realized very early on that leadership was key to doing that. What I probably struggle with is I never thought the conventional definition of a leader in terms of not the definition, but the sort of persona of being that kind of brash, super loud, super decisive person. That didn't always fit. I didn't really study with my own personality. And it's taken me a while to figure out how to make leadership congruent with who we are as a person as well. But I think the importance of leadership was something that came in very early into my life.
And you talked about your parents and your grandparents there. Were they really active in leading in different communities, organizations?
Yeah, so my parents were born just on the eve of Indians' independence. They got almost like Midnight's Children in some regards as well. My grandparents went through the whole, I guess, British occupation empire before that. So it just felt like I was born in the 70s. So India was about 25 years into its sort of its journey then as well. And there was a real sense of like, we all have a responsibility to try and make a difference to where the country goes. My parents decided to immigrate and head to the UK, but I think there was always that zeitgeist of, how do we make a difference? I think my grandparents would drill into me quite strongly over the summers there as well.
Yeah. And so as you grew up, were you active in leadership roles? Was that something that came naturally to you, or were you one of more of these like silent observers and taking it all in around you?
Yeah, so I think probably, honestly, the silent observer path was one that I probably went into the first maybe 25 years of my life, I guess, overall. I think one of the things that I grapple with as being an immigrant, there was that sense of obligation, not obligation, of duty, responsibility, passion. I was always very passionate about social causes, but there was also the sense of having to make sure that you had economic security. Safety was a big value. My parents would drill into me and stuff as well. And so there were almost two sides of, I guess, my personality that I was trying to reconcile with, I think, as well. I think the
Mm.
first 25 years, I very much stayed on the, maybe 30 years actually, stayed on the safer end of the path, I think, I guess, and maybe being in that silent observer part. So I went to Cambridge just to read economics. I went into consulting, went into tech, I did my MBA at INSEAD, very conventional sort of success markers as well. I enjoyed those experiences, but I think there was always that hunger to feel I could do more and contribute more as a leader, more widely to the world. And it took till I was 28 or 29 when I really jumped out and became a social entrepreneur. Spent 15 years working in education, founding two organizations, one in the UK and in deprived areas of the UK, building leadership in schools and in the city schools there. And then another 10 years working in countries like India. So it was great to go back and do
Mm.
something productive, but also in Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, where we try to look at how do we try and remotivate and the motivation of public sector workforces, teachers in particular, at very large scale. And both organizations collectively reached about 50,000 schools, about
Wow.
20 million children were impacted through that work. And it was an incredible journey as a founder CEO. And yeah, so I think but it just takes a while. It's not the first thing you do. You sort of sometimes have these chapters in life. And 3 years ago, I stepped out of the CEO role and became a leadership advisor to other CEOs and their organizations there. So to me, there's almost been those three chapters. And I think it's how each chapter try and makes the whole book, if you like.
Yeah. Can we go back to chapter one for a bit here? So, working with students, I love that. Were they younger in their teens or were they more university age?
Yeah, so I was working mostly in the school system. So the first organization I founded was called Teaching Leaders. And what we were finding in the UK was that there was four times more variation in standards and outcomes, all the way from
Wow.
grades to other measures of student performance within a school and between a school. And
Wow.
it took me, when I sort of heard that stat, it almost made me take a few minutes to comprehend it because in a company, let's say GE or a Google or whatever, you would never allow four times variation in performance between teams
Yeah.
in the same company. But what was happening in teaching was that it was a very collegiate profession, right? There was a sense of everyone's an equal, we don't want to interfere. So we realized there was a role, like say that you're the head of grade seven, for example,
Hmm.
or you're the head of history in the school, or the head of humanities. That sense that your role was to really lift up standards, motivate a team, build the right culture, build best practice, that wasn't really there. Those roles existed, but they were largely administrative roles. And so I spent, the first 5 of my years looking at how we could reignite that, redefine what leadership meant in a school context below the principal, not at the top of the
Right.
organization, but in that mid level. That sense of middle leadership was really a very key piece there.
And so instilling that into the students, did you see, I'm guessing you didn't do any sort of longitudinal studies to see like how that work and that focus of leadership at that level impacted those students later on in life?
Yeah, so we measured things like progression, academic outcomes, all of those things. And we could see very strong correlations between the work we were doing and those things lifting over time. We couldn't do randomized experiments or the
Right.
most rigorous research in this stuff, but definitely there were very high correlations. Also, very strong impact on the career trajectories of the teachers themselves. First of all, they stayed, which is itself a huge thing because many were working in very challenging inner city areas. Many would
Hmm.
leave the profession. So we really helped them stay. And also many have become now principals. Some have become the level above, like a super principal, where they run a chain of schools now, of like charter type schools and in the UK and so on as well. So it's been great to see that direct impact on children for sure, but also that sense of building an ecosystem of leadership where
Yeah.
those people then influence other leaders and you have that just kind of pyramid effect starting to happen very strongly.
Yeah. Wow. And so I can see how that would lead you into chapter two in terms of working with the school system and with the leaders and administrators in that area. What were some of the highlights of that work?
So I think what happened is India, for example, I was watching as I kind of went along, and India had built about 1 million schools over about 15 years, and about 240 million kids enter the school system not overnight, but over 15 years. Literally, though, before that, the country really only had schools for more elite groups, right? A lot of kids were not
Mm-hmm.
educated at all. And so there was a national law, which was amazing, that required every child till they were 14 to be in school full time. So enormous legislation. And the government did a very good job of building the infrastructure and building literally a school for every kilometer of the country. It's a huge
Wow.
country. So it was enormous. But that hardware piece was great. But the software, the sense of teaching really being a noble profession, being a really respected profession, that was actually thousands of years old in Indian tradition. But as it became part of the civil service and became kind of bureaucratized, a lot of those intrinsic drivers of motivation started to get eroded. So teachers started to feel like it was just a government job. They started to lose
Mm.
connection with the kids, with why they were doing it. They felt very micromanaged and didn't feel they could really control things. And they didn't feel they were getting better. There weren't many ways for them to really improve as a professional. And so they were not bad people in any way in sense of the imagination, but if any of us had those kind of workplace conditions, we'd all probably lapse into similar behaviors. So
Yeah.
a lot of teachers were absent. They didn't always teach to the best of their abilities when they were in school. There was a crisis of intrinsic motivation. And what I set up was an organization that tried to work in about, yeah, it was in about 50,000 schools and about 200,000 teachers, helping them reconnect with their passion and motivation by building almost sort of self-help groups like Alcoholics Anonymous for teachers. And
Yeah.
we had about 8,000 meetings a month where teachers in
Wow.
local areas would meet together, share ideas, share new practices, but also energize and motivate each other. And each meeting was very carefully designed and constructed in that regard.
And those meetings were facilitated by the administrators or the teachers themselves? Like you didn't have to train a lot of people, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so we were about 100 people as an organization, so we were able to stay pretty small.
Wow.
But we basically started signing up partnerships with the governments, with states. So India, like the US, has got states as its main. I think you guys have provinces in Canada, but
Yeah.
states are the main place where education happens. So we would work with the state and train all of their educational leaders, the trainers and the people at different local levels to run these meetings well and train and facilitate them as well. So it was all owned by government, run by them. And so it was really, we were trying to make it very sustainable. And it ended up costing about 50 US cents a child per year to run this
Wow.
approach.
Wow. And then the impact on the students of these administrators and teachers?
Yeah, so we saw some really powerful pieces around their emotional well-being, their enjoyment of school, their trust in their teacher, all of those elements. I think we realized that in terms of pure academic outcomes, we need also other things to happen alongside
Yeah.
this, like curriculum change and things. But the core sense of a child feeling safe in school, wanted by their teacher, respected, enjoying their period in school was a very powerful experience.
Yeah. Now I know that your first book was called Intrinsic, and I'm guessing like there's a similar word there. Was that the inspiration behind that book? I haven't read that book of yours yet.
Yeah, so it was really a chance to say, let's look at this whole question of intrinsic motivation. Famous researchers, Dechi and Ryan, have written a lot about some of the concepts, the pillars of it. Dan Pink wrote a book called Drive about 10, 12 years ago now,
Yeah.
where he tried to sort of popularize some of the research. But what I felt for the first book was that we needed to re-examine this, not just within a pure work lens, but also within a broader work and life lens as well, and a leadership lens. So it explored how to take intrinsic motivation to the world of work and careers, but also parenting, also our
Mm.
relationships, and also our work as citizens, as we talked about. So, how can we try to bring those elements in? And the key insight in the book, I had to really summarize it, is that you need a mix of internal, intrinsic, and external, extrinsic motivation. But right now, our dial is set very much towards the extrinsic. And so, how do we reset the dial so more of that comes from genuinely wanting to do something, feeling a real purpose in it, feeling we're in charge, and also feeling that we can get better at something? And how do you try and reframe those key areas of our lives with that intrinsic focus as well?
So I'm hearing the autonomy, the mastery, the I guess like you said, the purpose.
Mm,
Those three things sound like they were very strong for you from a young age. So is it fair to say like your intrinsic motivation is not necessarily something you're born with, but something that we can nurture and build individually?
absolutely. That was the key insight of the work I did in education. Carolyn, I
Yeah.
basically ran the largest intrinsic motivation initiative in the world, really, because it was such a big scale. And also, what we learned about, I learned myself as a leader that a lot of this is things we can nurture in a workforce. So I talk to a lot of CEOs now of some of the largest companies in the world where I work for, and they say, look, there's a real challenge with the next generation. They lack intrinsic motivation. And at the face value, that's true, but I think a lot of it's about creating the conditions where that intrinsic motivation can flourish.
Mm.
So the key point is we can't motivate someone else to do something, right? They are their own person, as you said, back to autonomy,
Yep.
but we can create the conditions for them to find and discover their intrinsic motivation. And so some of the work I do culturally with organizations is around how do we try to make sure those pillars are very strongly embedded, and also they're being deeply role modeled by the exec team and CEO.
Yeah.
Because we can do all the great programs in the world, but if it's not something that is really coming from the very top in terms of how they see the world and do it, it's not gonna work, for example.
And if they're in groups or organizations where the leaders don't have that intrinsic motivation, they're going to feel that and sense that and know that and not really have the inspiration to find it themselves.
Exactly. So I think with the intrinsic motivation question, it's about getting the leaders and leadership team typically to step back first and look at what drives them, using those pillars of purpose, autonomy, mastery you mentioned. How do you try and reconnect with those things as a leadership team? And once that's clear and it links to where the organization is going, how do you then create the conditions for that to be spread, and also for you to create great relationships and role modeling for that to translate across the organization?
I've got two questions there. What's the easiest part for teams, for these senior leadership teams to activate, put into
Mhm.
place? And what's the most difficult? Like, what's the biggest bridge that these leaders have to cross over?
So I think some of the work around mastery can be some relatively easy to put in place, because that's about getting better each day. This idea that every day we're seeing progress and getting better. And so there's a lot of work around continuous improvement we can create, where the first thing is really creating a feedback culture where you don't wait for the end of the year appraisal, that you
Right.
really create a culture where informal, rapid feedback is valued, and the idea that feedback is a gift that can be created very powerfully. What I've seen some of the best organizations do, and I've helped them do it, is to sort of build in not just technical mastery improvement, but also non technical or human mastery. So, how do you have conversations? How do you mentor someone? How do you communicate in difficult situations? How do you handle a challenging conversation? Building that in very explicitly, it's that kind of part of a mastery map of what an organization wants to do. So that's
Mm.
probably the most, it's not to say easy, but it's the one that is very tangible. And yeah, and you can build that. And I think many teams like it. I think a lot of next gen also really want that feedback culture to be quicker. They're used to that rather than waiting for, months or even the end of a year for that sort of thing to happen. So yeah, that's one thing that goes well. I think on the purpose question, what my work has really made me think about is sort of two types of purpose. That's probably the most challenging element.
Mm.
There's a kind of what I call now a big P purpose, which is about a wider problem that you can see your work contributing to. So I've been doing some work, for example, with one of the biggest restaurant groups in the UK recently, and there's a big element of this idea of creating a transportative experience for someone. You go to one, they've got restaurants that are, Indian, they've got restaurants that are Iranian, you name it, Taiwanese, etc. It's one of the most
Yep.
diverse groups in the world. But when you step into the restaurant, you need to feel like you're in Taiwan or
Mm.
Taipei or in Tehran or wherever it might be. That idea of making that kind of a North Star and feeling that if we want to be really deeply authentic and transportative in what we do, let's build a whole company around that concept.
Mm.
So I think of that as the big P purpose piece. But the small P, is really about helping, in that case, that idea of a guest promise, that every time a guest comes into one of our restaurants, they know they feel a deep connection to the staff. It's caring. There's a real sense of welcoming them and making them feel really that they're special people because they're coming into almost into our home.
Mm-hmm.
That's a small P purpose piece. And so weaving big P purpose and small P purpose into an organization, initially through the leadership, it's a bit more complex, but once that happens, it can be incredibly powerful for an organization overall.
And so what's coming up for me with that is just the congruence of that big P and little p purpose. And I believe, like, I wonder if that's what this next generation, they can detect that incongruence in
Mm.
organizations.
Yeah, I love that point. I think of, I was writing my second book, I try and learn a lot about the idea of almost like a gin and tonic. The big P is like the gin and the small P like the tonic, where you need a lot of, that big vision, that big piece is important, and something that really is an exciting North Star for the whole organization, especially younger members of the workforce to galvanize behind. And
Yeah.
feel is really true. But you can have all these great statements, but actually, if each day and every day we don't actually manifest that in a very practical way, that's where that incongruence can really show
Yep.
up and be there. So I think my thinking has really evolved on the purpose point that actually there are two types of purposes, big P and small p, and it's about that sort of gin and tonic where you're trying to bring both together and make it a really powerful cocktail from the combination of the two.
And depending on the organization too, you might have different amounts of the gin and the tonic, but you need both to make the flavor.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a very
Yeah.
nice way of looking at it actually as well. So there's no like specific recipe. It depends on the context, but both elements are really important, and they don't work without each other to complement them.
So I know you gave the example of the restaurant, which
Mm.
I think that's easy to get our heads around because you can sort of imagine yourself in that experience. Is there an example you could give us with an organization, you don't have to name them, but where the big P, how you help make that big P and little p purpose become more aligned?
So I've been doing some work with the B Corp movement, for example, which I'm not sure if you're familiar. They're a certification organization.
Yep.
So a lot of companies around the world will certify themselves to be B Corp compliant. So I've been working with a leadership team in the UK. They've been a great, an amazing team to work with. One of the things we're looking at is 3% of GDP now in the UK goes to the B Corp movement. So it's an amazing, it's
Wow.
only been around for about 7 or 8 years in the UK. It came from the States initially.
Yep.
But one of the, a very tempting approach would have been to say, let's make it 5% or let's get to 6 or 7%. But it's a very brave and courageous team. And they have been thinking about actually, we want to go much deeper. It's not just about incrementally doing more, but how do we go into the sort of the drivers of what drives business much more deeply on that big P purpose question.
Mm-hmm.
So, who influences business? It's investors, it's pension funds. Canada has one of the biggest ones in the world, of course.
Yep.
The Teachers Fund, it's legislation, it's policymakers, those questions. How do we try and move our direction to thinking about that big P again and reframing that? And I can't share too much of the details, but basically
Yeah.
that's been one of the most exciting projects. It was seeing a really new way of thinking about what that big P looks like in the next chapter. And
Yep.
that's what I really trying to focus on, those inflection
Mm.
moments where we're also trying to think about they've got to a certain height on the mountain. And they now want to look at what's the next mountain to climb? How can we do it even more impactfully?
And what I'm hearing there too is depth. Like
Mm,
they want to go deeper.
mm,
And that's sort of what came to mind is when I think of different organizations I've read about or worked in
mm,
or worked with, sometimes that purpose, the statement can just be a little bit too generic. And so, hey, yay, it sounds great on the surface, but the depth just isn't there.
mm. Yeah, no, I think it's so important. I think a lot of the work I do with organizations on these questions of purpose and direction are about being really authentic and being really
Yeah.
unique. And so it's not about just trying to be like everyone else. And actually, the more you can be distinct, the more that enables us to hire and retain the best people. It means we're unique to our customers or clients, being what the work we do. It also means that we can create our business model, our organizational structure, our culture around that uniqueness.
Yeah.
And it's also really clear what we stand for. And I think, many organizations tend to want to be all things to all people. And they do that for a while, but they realize at some point that they've got to be more specific, as in less vanilla,
Yep.
and really have that. And some people may not be attracted to them, which is also part of this is what are we not going to do or what are we not going to say?
Yep.
That's as important as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And I just love hearing that that group you're working with is looking for more depth because that's sort of a belief that I have is that we're craving more depth. We just don't know how to get there.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's a really powerful insight, Karen. And I think, and so most of the work I do is really about probing and not coming with the answer, but usually leaders have the answers, but how to help be a really constructive friend in that process and asking different
Yeah.
questions. And what I find a lot of times in leadership teams is that you have these kind of elephants in the room that are never addressed. So if we're going to go after X with our direction and purpose, that means probably less of Y.
Yep.
But we're not willing to let go and of some of that baggage of what we did in the past. And a lot of what I try and do is help organizations realize they've got to let go of some things in order to go deeper into others as well.
Yeah. The other thing that I think you said is so important there is that the leaders have these answers and creating space and opportunity to allow them to go in there and find it and explore it is a big part of this work. What have you found over the years that is really a turning point for leaders to shift from being everything to everyone to really giving themselves permission to go deeper and to be really clear on what they're not going to do?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've really realized is that leadership is not, of course, day to day execution matters. Of course, it's hugely important. But actually, when I look back at my time as a CEO, we had these kind of chapters, these inflection moments that really determine success. And
Mm,
I think of, those that I handle well, which really turbocharge and future proof the organization. Times I didn't handle them that well, and you can still see the scarring many years out from now. So I think of it more in terms of I really get involved when a leader is thinking about, look, what is that next mountain to climb? They have a bit of space to want to step back. And I think what makes and almost recognizing that inflection moment for what it is, right? It's not a day to day moment. It's a time to redefine that next mountain and go deep in it. What makes inflection moments so hard, I wrote about this in my second book, Inflection,
yeah.
which is really about that you need to navigate different time frames, right? There's a long term perspective, like
Yeah.
5, 10 years out. You've got the medium term, often 2, 3 years away. You've got the immediate stuff, like short term stuff. How do I make sure I deliver on my annual goals, my funding, whatever it might be? And so, how to balance those time frames together really matters. What a lot of leaders end up doing is they go for the short term fixes without thinking about the long term. And so, the process I try to work with them on, I call it guided journey, is to help them think about that long term direction piece first, the hour hand of the watch, if you like, as well.
Right.
Then go to the minute hand, then go to the second hand. But everything depends on the hour hand because if we're not sure where we're trying to go, it's really hard to know what kind of team we need to be and what kind of culture we want to build in order to achieve that as well.
What makes it difficult for leaders to start with the hour hand? Why do you think they're so attracted or drawn to the short term?
There's so much noise in leadership today,
Yeah.
just around attention, around focus. Also, I think we've over incentivized organizations, so there's so much short term pressure on things as well.
Yeah.
So it's really hard for them to step out of the second hand mindset. Ironically, though, I think the role of a CEO should really be almost all at the hour hand level. The role
Mm,
of a leadership team, the exco or the level around the CEO, that should be, I'd say, half hour hand, maybe half minute hand. A lot of those other levels can focus much more on the second and part of the minute hand as well. But I think if a senior leader really or the head of an organization focuses only on the shorter term elements, that's almost a waste of potential. I think they can do
yeah.
much more because I define leadership fundamentally, Carolyn, as helping and inspiring others to reach places they wouldn't have reached otherwise. And the only way you can do that is by setting a very compelling and clear and authentic and distinctive direction in terms of that where we go and having a very deep perspective on the area in which you work that is different from others.
Yeah. And so I believe you have a framework called the Dial framework. How does that fit in? I mean, I know there's some short term, long term, but how does that fit in with the guided journey?
Yes, the dial. So the D in dial really is about that daring of a new direction. It's the hour hand stuff around that we
Yeah.
talked about. How do you set that fresh, authentic direction? I is really about igniting potential in the whole team and ensuring that we leave no one's potential behind at that inflection moment. The A is around aligning motivation, so really making sure different stakeholders feel convicted and excited and engaged in where the organization is going. And the L is the learning to learn piece, really how do we keep learning as an organization as we go on this journey? And so
Mm,
during a typical, what I call inflection journey, it might last, for example, 6 months. Would systematically go through those four elements, starting with the hour hand and long term first and going through
yeah.
them, not in a kind of template or formulaic way, but I think, first of all, being really sensitive to where the organization is and what the core issues are around the organization and how the leaders in it see their role differently. So I've been doing some work with our National Health Service in the UK as an example. Primary care right now, which I was working with very senior
Mm,
leaders in primary care, it's going through a huge inflection moment where it's going to get more important. The role of
yeah.
diagnostics, the role of trying to really make sure chronic diseases are addressed much earlier on. So you don't actually need to go to secondary care quite as much as we do right now.
Yeah.
I think the leaders I worked with had very powerful perspectives on that transition, but they'd never been allowed to actually put that into practice and make it part of how they thought they could lead. What's happening in many sciences like the National Health Service in the UK is that there's almost like a paint by numbers approach. Your job is
Yeah.
to execute, here's the plan. But in fact, there's so much wisdom in that leadership group they're the ones ultimately running the organizations. They need to be able to almost embrace perspective as the fundamental kind of tenet of what leadership looks like overall.
Wow. Yeah. And so what's the biggest barrier do you think for leadership teams today? Like how can they, not everybody can bring you in to help them and guide them, but how can leadership teams find this inflection point? What's the inflection point for leadership in general?
Yeah. So one of the things I talk about in the book is sort of what are some of the triggers, what are the things to look out for that you might want to see and realize that you're at an
Yeah.
inflection point. I talk a lot about asteroids and starships, and asteroids being kind of something in the external environment that is about to dramatically shift how everything operates. Right. So in the
Mm,
healthcare example, it's
yeah.
that shift from primary, some secondary care to primary care, aging populations, chronic disease, etc.
Yep.
So looking outside, if you like, and looking at what's about to come and sort of hit us as an asteroid overall.
Right.
There's also the other side of it is the starship. So think of Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica if you're a sci-fi fan. What's happening within your own organization? It might be you have a new CEO. You might be
Okay.
that your workforce is getting younger and they have different expectations of what to look at. It could be a new board or a new investor coming on board or going public or whatever those things are. Usually when inflection moments happen, it's the combination of the asteroids and the starships at the same time
Okay.
that really creates the condition for an inflection moment as well.
Wow.
And the sweet spot is, I mean, sometimes, organizations wait and it becomes a crisis. They kind of
Yep.
ignore it, they don't recognize it, and then you've got to get into full sort of firefighting and troubleshooting. I do some of that when needed, but what is preferable almost always is to look at before you're there, like there's that sense of the next mountain, you're in good shape, actually defining that next chapter really carefully and consciously and intentionally, that will really future proof success for a long time to come.
And so when you think of leadership 10, 15, 20 years from now, how's it going to look? Look into your crystal ball.
Yeah, so I'm always worried about crystal balls, kind of, but yeah, but I think if you accept the definition of leadership being about inspiring and empowering others to reach those other places they wouldn't have reached otherwise, if you look at how leaders spend their time today, mostly a lot of it really is more about management, right? It's about making things happen, executing meetings, coordination, communication, which is all these things are important. I'm not trying to say they're not, but actually, if you look at the leadership element of a typical CEO job, how much time is spent, maybe 10, 20% if you're lucky. And I think the big opportunity is to shift the dial to make it more like 60, 70, 80%. And, there's a lot of hype on AI and so on, but I do think some of the things that AI and automation can do is take away some of the more managerial elements
Hmm.
and allow leaders to really focus on that core element of leadership and really on that hour hand piece of setting direction, but also the minute and second hands of really making sure the team is fully aligned, their full potential is being realized as they to reach that direction, and also they feel deeply motivated and engaged on the journey as well. So the human elements of leadership and a sense of really setting a long-term direction purpose, I think that can massively kind of increase in the mix as well.
Are there any, I guess, well-known leaders like that everybody might know who are listening that you think are really demonstrating this now and we could really learn from?
So a really good question actually as well. And I'm thinking about I think what has happened in the sort of I've many leaders in the network and those I worked with who maybe not be household names at all, but
Mm-hmm.
what I'd say is that I think if you look at say an Elon Musk or the kind of the guys we tend to sort of popularize in leadership, a lot of that stuff is the visionary stuff we often applaud, and also the really bold entrepreneurial gestures and risks they take and so on. Again, I think it's part of it, but it's not all of it. And so
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see in the future the leaders we really lionize are the ones who can do this piece really well overall. And I think many of the leaders we celebrate are can often be quite optimistic and that sense
Yeah.
of a deeper direction. That's not always as strong as it could be, even the ones we celebrate most around the world. So yeah, lots of examples that I can name that are a little bit closer to home and with some of the stuff I do around the world. But I think in terms of our kind of global icons, if you like, as well, I think there's still room to improve. I think if I can be overly
Yeah.
critical.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's also room to improve for who gets covered and who gets highlighted. So I know, do you still teach at Oxford and Cambridge in
I
leadership?
do.
What are some of the things that you're really inspired about with this next generation coming through?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm really thinking a lot about, Caroline, I'm actually working on a third book, and it's about this kind of idea of an inflection generation.
Mm,
And I sort of feel like if you think about the world ahead and what they're going to inherit, both Generation Z and Generation Gen Z and Gen Alpha, it's a world where some of our biggest existential risks are out there, right? Climate change, of course, and then of
yeah.
course peace and security, inequality, such big issues overall. And yet, I find that the disconnect between the generations greater than ever, and I hear a lot of frustration on both sides. It's wonderful to teach the
Yeah.
next gen in this program as well. It's one of the most sort of popular courses at Oxford, for example, at the business school. And I think one of the things I'm thinking a lot about is what is the common language that will try to align the generations, help
Mm,
them see and respect each other's perspectives, and help them work together better to solve some of the bigger problems in the world, and also to really ensure we have fantastic organizations that are going to deliver on all the human needs we need in the future as well. So I think it's about
it,
a mindset alignment. It's about maybe a language alignment.
yeah.
It's also about an understanding and a sort of sense of collaboration that can be different as well.
I'm really resonating with the language. I mean, just a fun side note with my
Mm.
son who's 20 and 19, like my 20-year-old just got home from university after his third year. And just hearing him talk, I'm like, whoa, back it up. Like, I need a dictionary. Like, what are you saying? And so I can only imagine how that would carry into the workforce. And like you said, just sort of cause a bit of a divide.
Yeah. No, I think what happened is, of course, in the 1990s, we had things like the outsourcing boom. And I think we also changed the sort of terms of engagement for employment overall. So
Yeah.
that kind of idea of the Japanese salaryman who'd stay for 30, 40 years, that's gone, right? We don't have that
Yeah.
anymore. And so one of the ideas of even, what does loyalty or reps even mean nowadays in the workforce, right? What does it mean? I think what's probably happened is that's gone down to another extreme where it can be quite transactional. Just take one example of that divide. That's also not very helpful. And so one of the ideas, for example, I'm exploring for this new book is about what does it mean to be all in, right? So you might not work in somewhere forever, you almost certainly won't. But when you are there, what is an acceptable and a powerful like tour of duty that means
Mm,
that over those 2, 3, 5 years, whatever, you really ensure you have deep impact and a legacy, and
yeah.
you can feel proud of that stage. And then this idea of a marriage where you're there to fill the company's mission, of course, but they also understand what you're trying to do and your mission statement as well. And
Yeah.
they're trying to, and that kind of idea of a partnership, a marriage between employee and employer or senior leader and younger leader, that's something I really think we can bring up more in the way that we think about work more widely.
Now, your second book, Inflection, is it, when did that one come out?
Came a couple of months ago, so end of was early February actually.
So you're already like well into the next one. Is your next one going to come out next year?
Yeah, hopefully that's the plan. That's the plan. Let's see how it goes. I'm trying to
Wow.
see. Yeah, I feel like I'm so lucky to work with such amazing leaders. And I said, Karen, I can only work with a small number, relatively directly. They're all over the world, different sectors, but it's a
Yeah.
tiny fraction of the leaders out there in the world. And I hope the writing, and I write a lot on LinkedIn as well, can just help take and sort of open up and spread these ideas more widely.
Well, I know I requested to join your LinkedIn network this morning and
Okay.
saw all that great work. Where could our listeners find more of your work and how could they hear more about what you do? Where could they
Yeah,
find
so
you?
they can, if they want to go into Amazon, they can look for Inflection, which is on book format, Kindle and on Audible. Intrinsic, my first book's also on there. But also just please feel free to follow or connect with me. And I write very regularly on LinkedIn about these topics. I really love co-creating things with my community and really getting ideas from them and learning with and from them as well. And there's more on my website, Intrinsic Labs, about just some of the organizational work I do as well.
Yeah, oh, it's wonderful. We're going to make sure that we have all those links in the show notes for the listeners. Are there any last advice before we go into the last three questions for listeners? Any last words of advice or insight
I'm
for?
sweating already, Caroline, for the philosophy now. So for the yeah, just say that I think overall this idea that not all leadership time is created equal, that it's very easy to go in and think that leadership is a day by day contest. Yes, to some extent it is, but actually you have these really important moments where how you navigate them with your team and with your stakeholders is going to future proof success for many years to come. So if you're at that point of looking at that next mountain to climb, try and step back, try and look at that differently. Take the time to really grapple with those questions deeply. Look
Mm,
inward, think about what your perspective is on the situation, and try to then really create a direction that's different, authentic, and aligned, and then really work hard to build the potential and culture of your organization. around that direction, but have the courage and conviction to make that inflection moment in the first place.
That's wonderful. Oh, thank you so much. So happy to have you on our show and that our listeners had a chance to hear all of this great wisdom from you. It's now time to shift to the three questions. So the first question is, so these three questions were inspired by my book that came out last year called Evolve. And so my first question is really an invitation to share with the listeners about self-awareness, a
Mm.
moment, a story, an inflection point, if you will, that really deepened your understanding of who you are.
Yeah, so I think when I set up my second organization, I was the founder CEO. I'd got a great plan for how I was going to look for innovations among teachers, right? In India, in that case. And we started working in the slums of Delhi, in some of the poorest parts of the world. And very quickly, I realized that the plan we had was not really the core, that actually the motivational benefits of what we were doing far outweighed the innovations themselves we were finding for the teachers.
Mm,
And I was at this really interesting crossroads where I'd persuaded lots of investors to invest in that first idea. It would have been very easy to keep going. Everything was set up. It would be a much easier ride. The whole thing around motivation was so fluffy, fuzzy, misunderstood.
yeah,
And you had that kind of, the sort of Robert Frost of the path less traveled, I guess,
yep,
the crossroads. And I think I was so pleased I took the path less traveled. It was hair raising at times, very scary at times as well. But I think it was an area that was so exciting and different, and there's so much to learn and develop in that area as well. And we could have so
mm,
much more impact in it. So I think between that first lesson of sort of when you have that path and you're wondering whether to go off on a limb and do the unusual thing, it's almost always better to go for yeah, the things a little bit quirkier and a bit more different and authentic
yeah,
as well.
a little bit more unknown and
Mm.
predictable.
So, but it took a lot of courage, and I think I could have easily imagined going down the other one as well. But I really I thank myself for taking the more adventurous path.
That's great. So my second question has to do with just rituals or practices. You know, we mentioned earlier just how there's so much noise. What are some rituals or practices that you really rely on to help you stay present and more regulated?
Yeah, so then there's things I need to work on in this area for sure. But I think for having a wide range of interests is really important. So
Mm,
I've been learning a lot more about. I've been starting to play pickleball, which I'm really enjoying now.
yep,
All the way to learning more about wine, about the history of art, just things that I've always really enjoyed but wanted to go deeper in. So I
right.
think taking out time from the typical, just to explore other interests, to put yourself in different worlds, so you think differently. And
Mm,
also, I think really widening social networks. I'm lucky to work with, ballerinas, chefs, sports people, as well as, of course, executives and so on in the work I do. And I really love that chance to work with a wide range of people because it just keeps our perspective fresh. So the
yeah,
key thing is that try not to get in a rut, try to really find different sources of energy and learning and really enjoy the other sides of you that happen when you explore those different areas. And we don't need to be one dimensional. We can explore different facets of ourselves and get to know very different people and different ways of looking at the world. And I found that a very powerful practice as well.
and it very much connects to what you said with the first question, which is going off the beaten path, so to speak, and a little bit unknown and courageous,
Yeah,
and see
they're
how those
linked,
two
of
link.
course. And I think the idea that
Yeah.
often to even have the more unusual perspective, if that's the definition of really the core of leadership, we've got to have wide perspectives, right? We had the Renaissance hundreds of years ago, but we've got into a world where we're often very hyper specialized. We're quite
Yeah.
myopic in how we think about the world. We're pretty often laser like focus, and that has some benefits, but it has a lot of disadvantages in terms of being, yeah, losing, not seeing the wood from the trees sometimes, I think,
Yeah.
what we do. So, yeah, I really encourage leaders to have different sources of energy, different sources of friendships, different things they read, different things they listen
Mm,
to. And all of those things, you don't have to even do much to consciously process them. Just the fact you're doing them will bring
yeah.
different ways of thinking about your core work as well.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. All right. Last question. And this one, I love music. I find
Mm.
music is a beautiful way to connect with others. And so, my final question for you is around a genre of music or a specific song
Mm.
that really you feel connected to something bigger than yourself.
So I guess because my background is very cross-cultural, and I love working across countries and so on. I'm loving some of the diaspora music around the world that's coming through.
Mm.
So I'm a big Burna Boy fan, for example. He's a Nigerian, but has crossed a lot of big audience in North America. They're actually going to see on Friday an artist called Priya Raghu, who's a Swiss Tamil artist and singer, for example, as
Oh,
well.
wow.
So I think just finding artists who are able to bring these different cultural elements. What's cool with both artists is that they have a lot of sort of, I guess, indigenous influences in terms of both,
Mm.
Africa and South Asian in their music, but they also really use some of the latest technology, a lot of some of the best work on Western production, beats, etc. as well. So they've really managed to fuse things in a very interesting and different ways. And I think it's that sense of something very unfamiliar, but also rooted in a different context. And that stuff can be really
Mm.
powerful to listen to as well.
Oh, and I think back to your second question, you've linked all these three beautifully, but the energy, the different energy that can bring, and with
Mm.
that indigenous wisdom embedded under it, I think that really can hit us in our bodies so differently as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I think a lot of it, Ken, is trying to not get it right in every sense. Just what you
Yeah.
listen to, and the way that our social media works, or even Spotify nowadays, that you listen to one thing and it'll recommend more and more like the same. And I think trying
Yeah.
to beat the algorithms and try and keep fresh, get different friends to give you their playlists, see what's going on in the world as well,
Yeah.
and just explore. It's really important, I think.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It really has been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, Sharon. I really enjoyed it.
All right. And for all of our listeners out there, I hope that you get a chance to pick up some of Sharath's amazing work, books. There's so many different ways that you can follow his work. Thanks again for joining us. Intrinsic and Inflection, the two names of Sharath's books, and also two elements of leadership that from our conversation today can really help define who you are as a leader, as a person, and help you find the purpose and the impact that you want to have in the world. And that impact is not necessarily a certain size. Impact is about authenticity and where you want to leave your mark in the world. And we can do that in so many places, in so many ways. And nothing is too small where we can leave our impact. I hope you appreciated this conversation with Sharath and that you do check out his work. He's doing some incredible work across the globe. And I would love to hear from you if you would like to reach out to me with any ideas for guests, if you have any feedback on what we're talking about, or if you'd like to just find out more about the work that I'm doing, please check out carolynswora.com. And if you could leave a review and a rating for this podcast on whatever platform you listen to, that would be greatly appreciated as well. We'll see you soon.